In the shadow of betrayal, where love collides with ambition and trust fractures under the weight of hidden schemes, emotions no longer follow the path of reason. What began as a fragile bond between a few souls slowly spirals into a storm of resentment, guilt, and unrelenting fury. In this world, wounds are not just carved into flesh but etched into the heart, festering until every whisper of loyalty is drowned in suspicion. At the center of it all stands a single act, one moment of blood, pain, and consequence, igniting a chain reaction that forces every character to face the darkest corners of their own soul. This is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of choices, consequences, and the unbearable weight of betrayal. The rain fell over the city like the sky itself could feel the chaos brewing inside the hearts of those caught in the web of schemes and betrayals. In that moment, the sound of an ambulance tore through the evening streets like a jagged blade slicing through still air. Dani lay on a stretcher, her breathing faint, her face pale, blood seeping from the deep wound in her abdomen, the result of Andre's hand, a knife, and one irreversible moment. It was an accident, at least on the surface. But for those entangled in this chain of events, the stabbing was never just an accident. It was the ignition point of a storm in which the fragile layers of love, trust, and loyalty began to crack apart. Andre sat collapsed on the curb, hands trembling, his eyes wide like a child lost in a dark forest. His breath was sharp and uneven, his heart pounding as if it wanted to break out of his chest. He could not escape the image burned into his mind, the knife shifting off course, slicing through the damp air, plunging into Dani's body. It had happened so fast, but the moment carved itself into him with searing clarity. It wasn't just guilt. It was the realization that everything he believed about himself, about the people around him, was unraveling. Dani wasn't just someone in his orbit. She was the person who had once made him feel seen, trusted, maybe even loved. And now, she was hovering between life and death because of him. In his head, questions crashed violently against each other. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but how could anyone believe that when the truth lay bleeding on a stretcher? Fear twisted around him like a vice, fear of blame, of hatred, of being cast out as a traitor. But beneath the fear was something darker, the sickening sense of being used. Andre could feel it in his gut that none of this had been truly random. Every small step leading up to this moment, every carefully planted suggestion, every seemingly harmless conversation, every orchestrated encounter suddenly looked like threads in a larger design. He was no longer the one making choices. He was the pawn that had been moved. Somewhere else, Bill stood in the sterile chill of an empty room, his fists clenched so tight they turned white. When the news came that Dani had been gravely injured, his world shattered in an instant. The pain wasn't the kind he'd felt before. It wasn't grief in the traditional sense, it was a suffocating fury that seemed to swallow everything. Dani was the person he loved, the anchor of every decision he had made in the last months. And now, the one who had put her in that hospital bed was Andre, a man he had trusted like a brother. Yet, the rage inside him was not directed solely at Andre. It burned most viciously toward Hayley. Bill began piecing together the signs he had dismissed, Hayley's subtle remarks hinting at cracks between him and Dani, the offhand jokes that planted quiet seeds of doubt, the unexplained meetings between Hayley and Andre wrapped in innocent excuses. He had brushed it all aside at the time. He trusted Dani. He trusted Andre. He believed their love was stronger than petty manipulations. But now, when he replayed it all, the puzzle came together with terrifying precision. Hayley had engineered this. She had built the board, and the three of them had been nothing but pieces to be moved. The anger inside Bill grew colder, sharper. This was not the kind of rage that flares up and dies out. This was controlled, purposeful, and dangerous. Hayley, the woman he had once called an ally, the woman who had always stood just close enough to seem trustworthy, had been pulling strings all along. As he walked toward her house, Bill knew this confrontation would not be about words. This would be the moment where the masks were ripped away and the truth was forced, brutal and undeniable, into the open. Hayley had always possessed a frightening calm in the face of chaos. She didn't panic, didn't lash out, never showed weakness. To everyone else, she was composed, intelligent, and in control. But beneath that flawless veneer lived a woman consumed by ambition and envy. She could not accept living in someone else's shadow, especially Dani's. Danny had everything Hayley craved but could never truly grasp: Bill's love, the effortless trust of others, the image of a woman who was adored rather than tolerated. Deep inside, Hayley despised her. But Hayley wasn't foolish. She knew raw hatred achieved nothing. So she moved quietly, strategically, building small fractures in what once looked unbreakable. She understood Andre better than anyone else. She saw how easily he could be pushed, how fragile his sense of control really was. He was impulsive when emotions spiked, desperate to prove his worth, desperate to be seen. All it took was the right kind of pressure, the right kind of manipulation, and he would unravel exactly the way she wanted. And so, she guided him, not with force, but with precision, until the moment arrived when everything crumbled. When Bill finally stood before her, his fury burned through the air between them. She saw it clearly in his eyes, but instead of retreating, she stood her ground, composed as always. That cold stillness only made his rage burn hotter. This wasn't shouting to vent. This was a storm tearing through the facade she had so carefully built. In Bill's mind, this was no longer two people facing each other. It was truth versus deception. Love versus manipulation. Hayley had already calculated this moment long before it arrived. She knew eventually Bill would find out. She had prepared the lines she would use to twist the story, to make herself look like the misunderstood victim. But what she hadn't accounted for was the raw intensity of Bill's rage. It wasn't reasoned. It wasn't negotiable. It was absolute. She had built her entire power on the illusion of control, and in this moment, that illusion began to crack. Meanwhile, Andre sat isolated in a hospital room, as the police started to ask questions. The word accident lingered in the air, but no one truly believed it. Every glance toward him carried a shadow of suspicion. To them, he was no longer Andre, the friend, the loyal one. He was the man who had driven a blade into Danny. He could feel the walls closing in, the air getting heavier, the silence becoming more accusing with every passing minute. Everything he had been, the trust, the respect, the place he held in their lives, was being stripped away, one layer at a time. But the real weight wasn't the world's judgment. It was the realization that he had let himself be used. Hayley had played him masterfully, and he hadn't seen it until it was too late. The anger in him didn't erupt outward like Bill's. It burned inward, silent and corrosive, coiling in the pit of his stomach like a slow poison. He began to wonder whether he had ever been anything more than a pawn. Whether every choice he thought he made had been his at all. While Danny lay unconscious in a sterile hospital room, everyone else was fighting their own private war. Bill stood on the edge of vengeance. Hayley teetered between control and collapse, her careful empire trembling beneath the weight of her own schemes. Andre stared into the void of what he had done, consumed by guilt, fury, and self-disgust. And Danny, unknowing, fragile, had become the eye of the storm, the silent center around which everything was being torn apart. By the time night fell, the city outside kept moving, unaware of the fracture lines splitting open beneath its surface. But inside those lives, nothing was whole anymore. Love had twisted into something brittle and sharp. Trust had been shredded. The hidden schemes that once moved quietly below the surface now rose like blades from the deep. Each of them had been backed into a corner, left with no righteous choice, only instinct, bitterness, and fury. And from this moment forward, nothing would ever be the same again. In the end, silence consumed everything. The screams, the accusations, the desperate attempts to justify the unforgivable, one by one, they faded into a suffocating stillness. The walls that once held shared memories now felt like a prison built from guilt and broken trust. Every choice had carved a scar, and every secret had become a blade that cut deeper than anyone dared to admit. Bill stood not as a man betrayed, but as someone who had stared too long into the abyss and realized it had been staring back all along. Hayley, in her calculated cruelty, had unleashed something she could no longer control. Andre, once a pawn, had become a mirror reflecting the consequences no one wanted to face. And Danny, fragile between life and death, was the silent epicenter of a storm that had already destroyed everything they thought they knew. Nothing would return to the way it was. The damage was permanent, irreversible, seared into their souls like a brand that would never fade. No apology could mend what had been shattered. No amount of time could cleanse the weight of what they had done. The truth, once revealed, had burned everything to ashes, and in those ashes, all that remained was the raw, unbearable aftermath of betrayal.